Midnight, February 15th, 2021, temperatures in Houston plunged to -18 degrees Celsius, while most of the city lay asleep. This was Texas, a state whose entire power grid had never been engineered to survive a winter like this one, because winters like this one were never supposed to happen here. More than 4 million households lost power, roughly equivalent to knocking out electricity for every home in the states of Ohio and Michigan simultaneously in the middle of a historic freeze. This was the worst infrastructure disaster in Texas state history. And it did not happen because nature was uniquely cruel, but because human decisions had left an entire grid deliberately unprepared. This is the story of what engineers warned about a full decade earlier and what every decision-maker chose not to hear. To understand why a state of 29 million people nearly collapsed in 4 days, we need to start with the thing Texas was most proud of: its very own isolated power grid. Texas is unlike any other state in America. It operates its own isolated power grid, disconnected from the rest of the country, managed by a single organization called ERCOT. This meant that when Texas faced a crisis, it could not simply import power from neighboring states like Oklahoma or Louisiana the way most American states can. The Texas power system was engineered to perform optimally between 25 and 45 degrees Celsius, perfectly calibrated for the subtropical climate of the Gulf Coast region. But in February of 2021, an exceptionally powerful Arctic air mass broke through the atmospheric boundary that normally holds it north and slid all the way down to Texas. This phenomenon is called the polar vortex, and in 2021, it pushed further south than it had since the 1980s, reaching deep into territory utterly unprepared for it. In the city of Abilene, thermometers dropped to -23 degrees Celsius, the lowest recorded temperature in over 100 years of local weather records. Along the Gulf of Mexico shoreline, the palm-lined boulevards of Corpus Christi lay buried under white snow, a scene that most residents there had never witnessed in their entire lifetimes. Water pipes across the entire state had no insulation because they were never designed for temperatures below zero, and they began freezing simultaneously in millions of homes and buildings. But the true danger was not the snow or the ice on the streets. It was what was happening inside the power plants, stretched from the panhandle all the way down to the coast. At the exact moment demand for heating reached historic highs, power plants began shutting down one by one because their own equipment was freezing along with everything else. Gas flow sensors froze solid, leaving plants unable to measure the fuel coming in, forcing automated safety systems to trigger emergency shutdowns to prevent explosions. Wind turbines across the panhandle also stopped turning, not because of snow, but because the lubricant oil in their gearboxes solidified at temperatures the manufacturers had never expected Texas equipment to face. What is critical to understand is that even Texas nuclear power plants were forced to reduce output because the exterior cooling water pipes feeding their systems had also frozen. Within 24 hours, the Texas grid lost 34 gigawatts of generating capacity, roughly equivalent to the total electricity output of the entire state of Georgia, simply vanishing from the system at once. ERCOT faced an unavoidable decision: either implement controlled partial blackouts immediately or risk total cascading grid collapse that could have taken weeks or months to restart. In the early hours of February 15th, ERCOT began implementing rolling blackouts, but what they projected would last 15 minutes stretched into 4 days for millions of households. Outside the windows of millions of Texas homes, snow kept falling and temperatures kept dropping, while inside, darkness and cold began seeping steadily into every room. When the lights went out, the first thing millions of Texas families realized was that their homes were not built to hold heat because they had simply never needed to be. Most Texas homes are wood frame structures with thin wall insulation, a design optimized to release heat outward in summer, but completely ineffective at retaining warmth in winter. Within 6 hours of losing power, temperatures inside many homes fell to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, roughly the temperature inside a standard kitchen refrigerator. Peak. Picture 4 million families, simultaneously, no electricity, no running water, no heat, in a cold that none of them had ever been built, stocked, or psychologically prepared to survive. Water pipes inside the walls of homes began bursting, not one by one, but in millions of locations, simultaneously, across all 29 million people worth of Texas. Water freezing inside pipes expands, generating pressure up to 90 kilograms per square centimeter, enough to rupture even the most solidly soldered copper joints. When pipes burst and water escaped, it instantly froze on floors, ceilings, and furniture, transforming living rooms and bedrooms into something resembling natural ice caves. More than $1.4 billion in damage from burst pipes in commercial buildings in Houston alone, before even counting the hundreds of thousands of private residences. The public water supply lost pressure entirely because millions of simultaneous pipe breaks had drained municipal water storage tanks below the level where pumps could function. Peak. This was no longer just a power outage. This was the moment Texas lost simultaneously the three things a modern society cannot survive without: electricity, water, and warmth. Residents of Houston, a city of 4 million people accustomed to tropical heat, began burning furniture for warmth, layering summer clothes because almost no one owned a winter coat. In San Antonio, lines stretched for several kilometers outside closed Heb grocery stores, people waiting in blizzard conditions, hoping to buy food and drinking water. Emergency warming centers opened at schools and community centers, but these very buildings began losing power and water in the same cascading collapse affecting everything else. Houston Methodist Hospital had to evacuate patients from several floors when ceilings began collapsing as burst pipes saturated the concrete structures above. At the exact moment emergency medical demand was surging, the Texas hospital system had to simultaneously manage power outages, burst pipes, and access roads blocked by ice and snow. The elderly and those with pre-existing conditions were the most vulnerable, particularly those living alone in the sparse, suburban sprawl where neighbors might be too far away to help. Many people tried using gas stoves for cooking and warmth indoors, unaware that CO fumes accumulating in enclosed spaces were causing silent carbon monoxide poisoning. During that week, at least 246 people died directly or indirectly from the storm, from hypothermia to carbon monoxide poisoning to traffic accidents on frozen roads. Think about this in another way. 246 lives lost. That is more Americans than died in the entirety of Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the worst flood in Houston's recorded history. In the low coastal plains south of Houston, across Brazoria County, sugarcane fields and cattle ranches lay buried under more than 30 centimeters of snow, a sight no one in the region had ever seen in their lifetimes. In the high plains of the Panhandle near Amarillo, livestock ranchers could not reach their herds for days because every state and federal highway was completely blocked by drifting snow and ice. Tens of thousands of cattle and livestock died from the cold across Texas, causing agricultural losses estimated at more than $500 million from that single week alone. The Phillips 66 refinery at Sweeney and petrochemical facilities along the Gulf Coast near Houston were also forced to shut down, disrupting fuel supply chains across the entire country. Natural gas spot prices in Texas jumped from around $3 to over $10,000 per million BTU within 48 hours, the highest single-event price spike ever recorded in American energy markets. Some Texas households on real-time market electricity pricing contracts received electricity bills exceeding $16,000 for a single week, a number none of them had imagined when signing their contracts. Peak. Picture this in another way. Texans did not just lose power and water when electricity finally returned, Some received bills large enough to bankrupt a family who did nothing wrong except sign the wrong type of contract. South of downtown Dallas, the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge, with its iconic white, arching steel cable, stayed structure lay coated in ice, while hundreds of abandoned vehicles sat frozen on the I-35 freeway alongside it. DART rail lines in Dallas and Metro Rail in Houston suspended all operations as tracks and signaling systems froze, leaving car-free neighborhoods completely isolated from food, water, and warming centers. Driving was also nearly impossible across most of Texas, a state that owned almost no snow plows and had stockpiled almost no road salt because those things had never been considered necessary. The COVID-19 vaccine distribution center at Fair Park in Dallas had to suspend operations for days as power outages and blocked roads made vaccine delivery and administration impossible. Drinking water became the single most precious commodity in Texas that week, as Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston all simultaneously issued boil water notices for their entire populations. In inner Houston, the bayou drainage channels the city built to prevent flooding had frozen into flat, pale blue ice ribbons stretching through commercial and residential neighborhoods alike. Along the Gulf Shore, fishermen near Galveston witnessed fish and sea turtles floating to the surface in a stunned state, thermally shocked by ocean temperatures dropping to abnormally low levels near shore. Over 10,000 Kemp's Ridley sea turtles, a critically endangered species native to the Gulf of Mexico, had to be rescued by volunteers and sheltered inside the South Padre Island Convention Center. While those volunteers collected stunned sea turtles on a frozen beach at South Padre, 550 kilometers away in Austin, Texas legislators were arguing about who bore responsibility for the crisis. ERCOT, the organization operating the Texas grid, had received a detailed report after a smaller cold event in 2011, explicitly identifying that power plants needed winterization to prevent freeze-related failures. 10 years passed, no mandatory regulations were enacted, no winterization standards were applied to Texas power plants because plant owners opposed the associated costs. The painful truth is that most of what happened that week could have been entirely prevented with an estimated investment of $50 to $100 per kilowatt of installed generating capacity. In that city of 3 million people, without power and without water, lower-income neighborhoods were consistently the last to have services restored, cut the longest, and suffered the most severe cumulative damage. Houston's Fifth Ward, one of the city's oldest African-American neighborhoods, lost power for an average of 20% longer than neighboring wealthier districts during the same storm. On February 17th, temperatures began edging above freezing in North Texas, but this brought a new problem no one had prepared for. Ice melting off rooftops and refreezing on walkways and driveways. As ice melted, millions of pipes that had burst during the freeze now began pouring water, turning the wood and drywall floors of hundreds of thousands of homes into indoor swamps. Secondary flooding from burst pipes damaged hundreds of thousands of homes already compromised by the cold, turning a single disaster into two consecutive disasters hitting the same properties. Plumbing repair crews from across Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma were mobilized urgently but fell drastically short of demand, with repair wait times stretching from 1 to 3 months for many households. Total economic damage from the winter storm was estimated at $196 billion, roughly equivalent to wiping out the entire annual GDP of the state of Louisiana in just 4 days. This made it the most costly natural disaster in Texas state history, surpassing even Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which had caused $125 billion in damage. The majority of that economic damage came not from nature itself, but from unprepared infrastructure, what economists now formally call the cost of inaction in the face of known risk. Texas's natural gas system which supplied about 42% of the state's electricity, was the single largest point of failure because outdoor extraction and processing equipment had no thermal insulation. Natural gas freezing in extraction pipelines in the Permian Basin meant gas-fired power plants had no fuel, even when their equipment was still functional and ready to generate electricity. This was a perfect negative feedback loop. You need electricity to pump and compress natural gas, but you need natural gas to generate electricity, and when one side collapsed, the other inevitably followed. The ERCOT system came within moments of total unrecoverable collapse in the early morning of February 16th, when reserve capacity fell to approximately 1,000 megawatts against a demand of 70,000 megawatts. If ERCOT had not shed load at precisely that moment, the entire Texas grid could have experienced what engineers call a complete dark start event, requiring weeks to months to restore power. This is what electrical engineers call the worst-case scenario, where recovery requires multiple large generating plants to be restarted from a state of absolutely zero power, a process of extraordinary complexity. Texas escaped that catastrophic scenario by a margin measured in minutes, just enough time for a handful of critical plants to maintain bare minimum output and prevent total grid collapse. When lights slowly returned to some areas on February 18th, Houston residents began assessing the real scale of damage as electricity illuminated what snow and ice had left behind. Across the state, infrastructure recovery teams discovered more than 1,300 main municipal water mains had burst, a repair challenge comparable to multiple cities being simultaneously hit by a catastrophic event. Hundreds of thousands of bottled water delivery trucks were mobilized from neighboring states, but with a population of 29 million, even that number could not meet the statewide demand. On the plains west of San Antonio, herds of Texas Longhorn cattle stood motionless in deep snow. Even this native breed adapted to heat unprepared for cold of this unprecedented depth. The coastal marsh habitat of the critically endangered whooping crane at Matagorda Bay froze for the first time in decades, cutting off their food supply just as the population had reached a fragile recovery milestone. Subtropical and tropical plants across Texas, from highway palm trees to backyard banana plants, froze to death and would take years to recover or replace, altering the visual landscape of entire neighborhoods. Wastewater treatment systems in Houston and Dallas lost power and experienced raw sewage overflows into surrounding bayous and bays, contaminating waterways for weeks after the storm ended. By the 20th, power had largely returned, but Texas faced an unavoidable question: how to prevent this from happening again in a world where extreme winter events are becoming more frequent. The snow finally melted, but what it left behind, the questions about accountability, about regulation, about the price of deliberate choices, those things did not melt with it. In the month following the storm, federal and state investigation teams began assembling evidence for what most energy engineers had understood clearly within the first week. This was a preventable disaster. In June 2021, Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 3 into law, mandating that all Texas power plants be winterized to meet new cold weather standards. But critics pointed out that the law contained numerous exemptions and lacked enforcement mechanisms strong enough to compel the largest energy companies to comply when the costs were high. Property damage in Texas from the event was estimated at over $70 billion, with roughly one-third of that concentrated in damage to public infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and municipal water systems. Hundreds of thousands of Texas homeowners had no freeze coverage because their standard home insurance policies excluded extreme cold events, deemed so unlikely in Texas that coverage was not required or marketed. The federal government declared a major disaster for the entire state of Texas, unlocking FEMA funding, but the complex application process left many lower-income families unable to access the assistance they qualified for. Hispanic communities along the Texas-Mexico border in El Paso, Laredo, and McAllen were among the hardest hit and also received the least proportional assistance relative to their populations. Looking broader, the Texas 2021 event revealed a troubling pattern. Climate change is not only making summers hotter, it is making winters more erratic and unpredictable in both directions. The polar vortex weakening due to rising Arctic temperatures is making extreme cold air outbreaks slip southward more frequently, a counterintuitive paradox of climate change that most people did not expect. This means what happened in Texas in 2021 may not be a historical anomaly, but rather a preview of what many states and countries not historically known for severe winters will face in coming decades. South Korea, Japan, and especially Southeast Asian countries with tropical climates like Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines are recognizing that their own infrastructure may have similar preparation gaps in other climate extremes. The lesson from Texas is a lesson in probabilistic engineering thinking. If an event has low probability but catastrophic consequences, the cost of not preparing consistently exceeds the cost of preparing. Neighboring states like Oklahoma and Kansas, which face harsher winters regularly, had winterized their energy infrastructure decades earlier at a fraction of the cost that Texas ultimately paid for refusing to do so. Since 2021, Texas has invested billions in grid upgrades, but energy experts warn that implementation progress remains considerably slower than what the current rate of extreme weather events demands. The central question that the Texas event poses to the whole world is, how much of what we call natural disasters is actually nature, and how much is human choice accumulated over decades of decisions? Some cities are drawing the right lessons. Seoul and Tokyo expanded cold resilience standards for their infrastructure after 2021, directly citing the Texas experience as the motivating case study. And within that lesson lies a simple truth that Texas paid $196 billion to learn. Infrastructure not designed for conditions it has never seen is infrastructure waiting to fail. Since the February 2021 event, more than 40 American states have reviewed and revised their extreme weather resilience standards for power grids and water systems. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, issued new rules requiring power plants participating in federal energy markets to meet cold weather preparation standards for the first time in its history. But ERCOT, because it sits outside the federal grid system, remains a special case, and FERC's new rules do not fully apply to most of Texas's power infrastructure in a mandatory sense. Polar vortex early warning technology has improved significantly, with climate models now capable of predicting polar vortex displacement events 14 to 21 days in advance with actionable accuracy. The challenge is no longer forecasting, it is action. Whether a state, a utility, or a city can prepare, protect, and harden its critical systems in the 2 weeks before such an event arrives. The world's tropical coastal cities, from Bangkok to Mumbai to Ho Chi Minh City, face analogous versions of this same challenge, but in the opposite direction with rising seas and intensifying storms. The common question all of those cities and Texas share is whether the political cost of investing in infrastructure that citizens hope will never be needed can be justified before a disaster forces the answer. Since February 2021, at least 3 other extreme cold events have struck parts of the United States that were unprepared, confirming that Texas that year was not a once-in-a-century event. In the engineering rooms of ERCOT and in energy engineering organizations worldwide, the Texas 2021 event has become shorthand for the category of systems failure that no one wants to repeat. 5-year retrospective analysis shows Texas has invested over $9 billion in winterization and grid upgrades since the event, equivalent to roughly 4% of the original total damage figure. Those who survived that week in Texas described the experience in one strikingly consistent way, not as fear of nature, but as the feeling of being failed by the systems they had trusted to protect them. Midnight, That was the moment 4 days that changed Texas began. And the question Texas has not yet fully answered, whether it can happen again, is still being written right now in every decision grid operators and legislators make each winter